All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Fiveable stream. This is a review for APUS history. A lot of people have their midterm, semester finals, all of that kind of stuff coming up. So we are there now. If you're watching on my YouTube channel, this is a broadcast that is sponsored by Fiveable. Anybody can watch this tonight, but make sure to click in the link. Okay, so you can go to fiveable.me/sign up, and then you can use code Tom Ritchie, just my name, Tom Ritchie, for 30% off before midnight tonight. Okay, so just make sure that, if you're interested in Fiveable, go ahead and do that. The questions that I'll be taking are all from Fiveable members. Okay, so those of you who are in the chat, there are about 10 of you in here. Let's see. So y'all go ahead and ask questions. Okay, y'all go ahead and ask your questions, and those are the questions that I'm going to be answering. Okay, so go ahead and get those questions in. I don't see any questions yet, but go ahead and get those in. Okay, so go ahead and get not a Fiveable member, go ahead and click on that link that's in the description for some other stuff. Now, also next week, Fiveable is doing a massive Kahoot game. Okay, so that's going to be next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Same time, so a week from tonight, and that is going to be going on. You'll want to go to fiveable.me/Kahoot to register. Okay, so if you want to go for next week's Kahoot game, fiveable.me/Kahoot. Okay, so make sure that that you take a look at that. And again, we are just kind of working out. This is the first time that we're doing this live stream. So let me just make sure that this is working on my channel. Again, Fiveable members, go ahead and get questions asked. Okay, so let's go ahead and ask questions. I don't see any questions from Fiveable members yet. So let's go ahead and get that going. Come on, y'all. Or else I may have to just go to the YouTube chat and we'll see what people have for me there. Okay. So as far as that goes, we've got that going on. All right. And I think that everything's working. I'm still waiting on Fiveable members to get. Okay, I do have a question. I do have a few questions now. Excellent. Okay, so still not wanting to update my thumbnail, but we'll work on that later. Okay, and we've got some people commenting on my channel. Hey there, Kristen and Megan and Joshua and Giassi. All right, now as far as that goes, remember, ladies and gentlemen, because this is a Fiveable broadcast, I'm only taking questions from Fiveable members. But stay tuned if you're watching on my channel, because I will be broadcasting again just on my channel and taking questions from the public. So let's go ahead and get in here. Okay, so I see here. Yes, so thank you, Leal. Oh, we've got a few here. All right, so first of all, let's go ahead and start. Can you talk about what are the New England colonies, Chesapeake, South, etc., and their differences? Okay, so when we're talking about the 13 colonies, one of the most important things to understand is the difference between the three groups of colonies. Now, for APUSH, it's not like you need to know the inner workings of the Connecticut colony or something like that. Okay, so you're not studying all 13 colonies as much as putting them into maybe 3.5 groups. Okay, because first of all, you've got the New England colonies. Now, what I tend to do for each colonial region is to pick a colony or two that's representative. Okay, so in this case, for New England, Massachusetts is, of course, your most representative colony. Now, the New England colonies, they are different from the other colonies because their primary business model is not based on agriculture. Okay, so that's something that is important to know, that it is based on shipping, trade, of course, timber and fishing, and these are the bases for the economy. Then the New England colonies are more religious than any other colonies. That the primary motive for colonization, if you were going to New England, was because you were religious and you'd been persecuted. And so you see that. Now we've got two groups here, the Puritans and the Separatists. separatists. Now, the Puritans and the separatists are both Calvinists. They have the same doctrines, but they have different approaches. The Puritans who wanted to purify the Church of England, the separatists who wanted to make their own church. The Plymouth colony, for example, was settled by a separatist group, people who saw themselves as creating a new church apart from the Church of England, but they were all Calvinists. Now, the other thing to note is we remember that although we learned when we were little and we dressed up like pilgrims and Indians and we heard about, oh, they came over here for religious freedom, it's not in the American sense, okay, that these people were not very tolerant of other people. Now, the biggest examples of religious intolerance in the New England colonies would be Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Okay, Roger Williams, who was a minister, who said that it's really not the state's job, the government's job to tell people that they have to go to church. People should not be forced to worship. That should be a choice. Sounds very American, right? Yes, but it was not in line with the beliefs of the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Another name you want to know is John Winthrop. Okay, he would be another one. So John Winthrop, and then John Winthrop, the governor of the city on a hill, and Roger Williams, who, because he was saying that you shouldn't force people to be religious and people should be able to choose their own religion, he was exiled and started what later became Rhode Island, which for him was Providence Plantations. And then, of course, there was Anne Hutchinson, who was a woman who was leading Bible studies, which wouldn't be seen as weird today, but for this community, the official religious leadership had a lot of power. And so not only was Anne Hutchinson not a minister, but she was also a woman, and she had a lot of people going to these home Bible studies that she was offering. So with that in mind, Anne Hutchinson was also exiled because she didn't fit in with the community. So remember that religious intolerance in New England. Now, let's contrast that with the religious tolerance in Pennsylvania. So when we look at the middle colonies, I generally look at Pennsylvania as my characteristic colony for the middle colonies. And that was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker. Okay, William Penn, who was a Quaker. And as a Quaker, he was, of course, against any kind of force, any kind of coercion. And so in the Pennsylvania colony, you've got complete religious liberty, and everything is, everything's all nice and happy. Of course, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. So you're more likely to find religious tolerance in the middle colonies, or mid-Atlantic, whatever the the terminology is that you're seeing there. But understand that the two are interchangeable: middle colonies, mid-Atlantic colonies. And so William Penn is a Quaker. He's settling this for religious toleration. And then you've got, as far as that goes, the economy of the middle colonies. The economy of the middle colonies was based on staple crops. Okay, staple crops meaning crops to eat: corn, wheat. Okay, so they're growing staple crops. Now, then we go to the southern colonies. Now, when you mention the Chesapeake colonies, remember that the Chesapeake colonies, that's the Chesapeake Bay. One thing that happens to a lot of people is they confuse the Chesapeake Bay with the Massachusetts Bay. Okay, the Chesapeake Bay is that bay that you see where Virginia and Maryland, it's got that little thing that kind of juts out. That's the Chesapeake Bay. So when we talk about the Chesapeake colonies, we're talking specifically about Virginia and Maryland. So it's kind of the upper South. And this is where tobacco was cultivated. So the Virginia colony and the Maryland colony as well, they are focusing on the cultivation of tobacco. And that shows you that goes into the southern focus on cash crops, which is going to be pretty consistent throughout the history of the colonies in the United States during the Civil War. Now, until the Civil War, but the only thing that changes is the actual crop. One thing you want to remember about colonial America: there's no cotton being grown as a cash crop. It was too inefficient before the cotton gin came around. So the Chesapeake colonies, you're looking at Virginia and Maryland, colonies that are focused on cash crop agriculture, not as likely to be religious as you saw in the New England and some of the middle colonies. And also, as far as like the Carolina colony, South Carolina, you're going to see also cash crops, but rice and indigo. instead of tobacco, like you're going to see in Virginia and Maryland, and I suppose, you know, the North Carolina colony, because North Carolina grows a lot of tobacco today. So remember that the Chesapeake colonies, it's kind of a subcategorization of the Southern colonies when we're talking about those colonies around the Chesapeake Bay. One last thing that I'll focus on is that while both New England and the Southern colonies, they both had representative government, these traditions of representative government that you see brought in uh, by the British. But the New England tradition is much more egalitarian, based on town meetings where everybody pretty much has an equal say. Whereas in the South, you have a much more aristocratic basis for government, where it's determined by land ownership, and you have representative government where the large landowners would meet in assemblies such as the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is the oldest representative assembly in the present day United States. So that's a little review of colonial America for you. Okay, so as far as then looking at let me see a few things here. Let me see if I can get these. Now, remember, those of you who are Fiveable members and you're in here in the Fiveable chat, you can upvote questions, okay? So if somebody's asked a question that you think, you know what, I'd like to see that question answered too, then you'll get to see, you'll get to do that. So really, I'm going to kind of base this on the upvotes. Okay. Now, what was a social effect of the Mexican-American War? Now, as far as a social effect, I'm not quite, I've never heard the question asked that particular way. But the biggest effect of the Mexican-American War is now you've got all of this land that what are we going to do with it? Specifically in terms of, is this land going to be open to slavery or is it not? The Wilmot Proviso, remember, which said, even though it never passed the full Congress, it was a policy position. It was a policy statement by the Free Soilers that any land taken from Mexico is going to be closed to slavery. So that's the thing about the Mexican-American War, is it completes this process of manifest destiny almost, because you've got the Gadsden Purchase, which, according to Jimmy Fallon, nobody ever makes a joke about, right? But the Gadsden Purchase, later we get a little bit extra. But as far as the Mexican Cession, that's what, and it leads to the Compromise of 1850. So I don't know if I would necessarily. Now, the other thing to note is that this exam really, years ago, it used to, the exam, the way it was written, used to go into like political, economic, social, that sort of thing. It's not that like regimented anymore. So, when you ask those questions, think about like an overall effect rather than just a social effect. But you can see that the Mexican-American War definitely ignited conflicts over slavery in the West. Remember that there were only the abolitionists, who were a very small group before the 1850s. And even during the 1850s, they were a substantial minority. Only the abolitionists had a problem with slavery in Alabama. Whereas the Free Soilers, most of your anti-slavery movements in the 1850s, the more popular ones, they were much more focused on stopping the spread of slavery into the West. And that, of course, the Mexican-American War brings this together on a whole new front. And that kind of gets to the question that you've asked here. Let's see. We've got one question here that I'm trying to figure out. Okay, I want to do this as a question. Okay, the question's already been posted. What effect did manifest destiny have on slavery? So that's the thing, that when, and you get into all of these different, people, they want to categorize things as just like one thing. Your mind wants things to be as simple as possible. Okay, so yes, slavery is an issue during the antebellum period, and certainly William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, these people are abolitionists, and they want to get rid of slavery everywhere, even before the annexation of Texas or anything like that. But manifest destiny, with the annexation of Texas and the Mexican Cession, it starts new debates about the spread of slavery, which before that had been kind of a settled question. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 really kind of settled the issue of slavery on that 3630 line within the Louisiana Purchase. So as long as that was the United States, then that was okay. People had already settled that question and it seemed to be resolved. But when you go to enter manifest destiny and we've got all this new land, do you extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific? Do you continue to let states in as slave state, free state, slave state, free state, where they're on equal terms with each other? So do you do that? What is it that? How do we handle this? And so manifest destiny really gave rise to the free soil movement, this movement that slavery will not be allowed to spread to the West. And certainly Texas was the last slave state ever admitted into the Union. After that, all of the states that were admitted were free states. There's not a single slave state that was admitted in the 1850s. Of course, Kansas, you had the two constitutions, but then during the Civil War, they took the Topeka Constitution rather than the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. All right. Now, as far as the First Great Awakening, okay. Now, there are a lot of people that try to connect the First Great Awakening to the Revolutionary War, and I'm not sure what, there are a lot of, sometimes I get these questions and I don't know where they come from if you're trying to answer something specific for your homework, but it's like in trying to, it's just we try to shove these things into a box, okay? But as far as what's important about the First Great Awakening, it brought about a more emotional approach to religion. And if you think about that, I mean, that's one thing that's kind of a trademark of the United States. If you think about religions that emphasize a more emotional approach and a less rigid approach, those are present mostly in the United States and places where the United States sends missionaries. Now, the emotional preaching is a big deal about the First Great Awakening. Also, that you start to see kind of the democratization of religion, because before this, it was largely, a minister is somebody who has been to one of these colleges, has studied, is very well versed in Latin and Greek and all of that kind of stuff. Well, the First Great Awakening, you have a lot of itinerant preachers. And so they're just going around preaching to whoever, like George Whitefield would go around preaching in the open air because a lot of churches closed themselves to him. Now, that's another thing about the First Great Awakening, is that it led to a lot of divisions, okay? Because what you had was the lower classes that were rejecting the religion of the elite, this elite approach to religion, which was very traditional. Now, if you want to make a connection to the Revolutionary War, you do see that the Church of England is being challenged. Both the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, you see a rise in evangelical denominations, the Baptist, the Methodist, and other groups like that, that are still very prevalent where I live in the South. And so as far as that, you could go into that and then just kind of the democratizing of religion. But, I would credit the Enlightenment with, leading to the American Revolution and the ideas there much more than I would credit the First Great Awakening with leading to the American Revolution. And that gives us a nice little segue here. What were the differences between the First and Second Great Awakening? Now, what they had in common. Now, this is the thing when you have to do a comparison essay, for example, that, you've got to think about what do they have apart from each other, and then what do they have in common? Okay, so I draw a box typically that, I've got a box here for the First Great Awakening, a box here for the Second Great Awakening, and then a box under it that shows these are the things that they have in common. Okay, so that's what I'm going for with that. So first of all, let's talk about what happens with with both of them is the emphasis on emotional preaching. That's the biggest thing there. And of course, the rise of non-traditional faiths and non-traditional approaches to religion. Now, the First Great Awakening, even though you had this emotional hellfire and brimstone preaching, it was very heavily influenced by Calvinism. So when you think about like sinners in the hands of an angry God, you're basically in God's hands. You're hanging by a thread. It doesn't really talk about your power to influence your eternal salvation. It's more focused on you need to be afraid of God. That is this Calvinist approach, because God's already made the decision before you were born, right? And then in the Second Great Awakening, the approach is much more based on a doctrine called Arminianism, which has nothing to do with the country of Armenia, but it was a guy, a Dutchman actually, Jacobus Arminius, who was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church, but he challenged some of the prevailing Calvinist concepts. And Arminianism is a religious term, which you don't necessarily need to know this term for the APUSH exam, but it might not hurt, that it's focused on that the individual has some say, okay? That God has like Calvinism, God has made his decision and there's really nothing you can do about it. Arminianism, God has pretty much left it to you. He has given you a say in whether you want to receive salvation or not. And that's why when you look at, like, when you go to a church service that's evangelical in nature, that you see an altar call at the end where they say, does anybody feel convicted? Do you want to come up and and profess your faith? And so that's one of the things about the Second Great Awakening, is that you have a choice in the matter. And the other thing is, if you have a choice in the matter and God is, it's like God's offered you eternal life, but if you're doing bad things, then you're probably not going to heaven. And so when you start to think about, well, they start challenging all of these social evils, that after the Second Great Awakening, it's like, well, you know what? There are all these things that are wrong in the country today, like slavery and people drinking alcohol and beating their wives and stuff like that. And so you see that the reform movements, that's the biggest thing there, I think, with the Second Great Awakening, is it gave rise to social reform movements such as abolitionism and temperance. And so that's really, I think, the biggest legacy of the Second Great Awakening, whereas the First Great Awakening challenged prevailing religious institutions, but didn't lead to the same degree of social reform afterwards. All right. So as far as this goes, okay. So let me take a look. Remember, Fiveable members, y'all can upvote. Now I see here. Oh my goodness, really? Now, okay, again, sometimes y'all, okay, try to keep these questions focused on what might actually be like preparing you for the exam, and not so much to answer a specific question, okay? Because that's really more of a, this just reads more like a homework question, but I'm not sure here. Now the thing is, I'll take a stab at it. 1844, of course, was the year that James K. Polk was elected president, and James K. Polk is, of course, associated with the concept of manifest destiny. And so, government policies from 1844, which after James K. Polk was elected, but before he even took office, the United States annexed Texas by joint resolution of Congress. So that was a manifest destiny that was a manifest destiny program. And of course, the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession. Now, I would say 1862, you're talking about the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act. So I would say that fairly consistent, even though in 1844, you see the Democratic kind of manifest destiny view, but in 1862, those bills that are passed by Congress, the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, these are really, they're focused on settling the West. And so with that, that's something that you can kind of make a distinction on there. But yeah, I would say that they were fairly consistent because the United States government throughout that period remained focused on the settlement of the West. Okay, and can I mention a brief timeline of political parties? Okay, so the first now, of course, before even the first two-party system, you had, of course, kind of the temporary party system, if you could call it that during ratification, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, that is not really so much a party as much as, where it's a one-issue kind of thing. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and then the Constitution is ratified. Now, once the Constitution is ratified, it was a few years before political parties really took shape. And what happened, of course, where you had these differences of opinion between Jefferson and Hamilton, that it became evident that Hamilton had a view of what the Constitution meant and what he wanted for the federal government. Of course, yeah, I don't think Hamilton really cared that much about the Constitution as much as a means to an end for a larger central government. And of course, you could say that Jefferson, it's a very similar thing. Jefferson didn't even have a hand in drafting the Constitution, but Hamilton saw the Constitution as more of a nationalistic kind of document, which of course is what he wanted to see. And then for Jefferson, it's more the Articles on steroids. And again, just kind of what he wanted to see there. And so it became apparent that you've got really two philosophies here. And of course, that leads, you see James Madison starting to go over to Jefferson, because although he and Hamilton had a shared interest in ratifying the Constitution, once the Constitution was ratified, Madison thought that Hamilton was going a bit too far with things. Okay, so as far as that goes, you have the first party system, the Republicans and the Federalists, the Jeffersonian Republicans, sometimes referred to as Democratic Republicans. Historically, the history discipline has referred to this party as Jeffersonian Republicans, but it looks like the redesigned exam is using the Democratic Republican format, which I think, is usually political science, but it's something to distinguish Jefferson's party from the Republican Party that comes up later. Now, the first two-party system, you've got really this Jefferson versus Hamilton, okay, the Hamiltonian Federalists versus the Jeffersonian Republicans, and this lasts through the War of 1812. And after the War of 1812, you have what's called the era of good feelings. Now, it doesn't mean that there was never any political discontent, but James Monroe, in his by the end of his first term, and remember, the War of 1812 was kind of the nail. The Federalists really had ceased to be nationally competitive before the War of 1812, but after the War of 1812, the Hartford Convention was, of course, cast as a treasonous gathering, whether it was or not. I think the Hartford Convention had a lot of good ideas that they proposed, but that was something that after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party never was really able to regroup to compete on a national level. And so during the era of good feelings, which was during James Monroe's presidency, you have this period where you don't have political parties. Now, of course, that comes back with the entrance after the election of 1824, which was just a huge mess, was resolved in the House. You had 4 people running for president, and then you see what happens there with the corrupt bargain. And so then you start to see, okay, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, they're kind of going this way and starting the Whig Party, what will become the Whig Party, first the National Republicans, and then Andrew Jackson and his faction, which will form what they called for a time the Democratic Republicans, and then just shortened to Democrats. Okay, so the Democratic Party and the Whigs. During most of the antebellum period, those are the two parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, after the 1852 election, the Whig Party fell apart. Basically, the Whig Party could not withstand its conflicts after the Mexican-American War, because the Southern Whigs were friendly toward the interest of slavery, and the Northern Whigs very much were not. And so the after the election of 1852, the Whig Party pretty much split up, and that's where you have, the third party system, which materializes after 1860. Okay, where you have the Republic. Now, the Republicans contested the 1856 election, so you could say that it began the 1850s, but at the same time, the Republicans didn't necessarily contest the 1856 election as strongly as they did later. But it's in the 1850s that you see the formation of the party system that we know today, the Democrats and the Republicans. All right, so as far as that goes, so first party system, the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Federalists, era of good feelings. Second party system, the Democrats and the Whigs. And then the third party system, the Democrats and the Republicans. And so we've got that question answered as well. Okay. So with that, and remember, Fiveable members, y'all can actually upvote questions. So I've got a couple of upvoted questions here. And the mid-19th century, what were the causes and the consequences of religious and intellectual movements on American reform? Okay, so as far as that goes, I would say the Second Great Awakening had a major impact on American reform movements as far as an inspiration. If you're looking at the utopian communities, if you've taken AP Euro before, thinking about Romanticism, that is something that had a big influence on some of these writers and some of these communities that were formed at that time. And of course, the abolitionist movement, this is something that really changed the political climate of the United States as that gained steam. Remember, Jefferson, when he heard about the Missouri Compromise, Jefferson, even though he was retired, he was very panicked because he said that once people start arguing over slavery as a national issue, it's kind of like today. I mean, if you think about like abortion, for example, if that were something that was decided within states, that there wouldn't really be a lot of controversy in most states. But once that becomes a national issue, then people start to line up in opposing camps, and it becomes very controversial to the point where there's not really a solution to it. And slavery was something similar as that became a federal issue. But the abolitionists, who were influenced by the Second Great Awakening and a desire to do good and to do things that are a desire to do things that are in line with what God wants, we see that there came to be a position where there really wasn't any shot of any kind of meaningful compromise between people who felt one way or the other. And so with that, I would look at that. Now, can I briefly go over the major compromises in the antebellum period? Gladly. Okay, so the major compromises. Now, remember, we start with our friend Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Okay, and so Henry Clay is famous for three compromises. All right, you've got the Missouri Compromise, the Nullification Compromise, and the Compromise of 1850. So that's why Henry Clay gets so much credit for being a compromiser, is he participated in all three of those compromises and was really like one of the biggest people there. Even though the Compromise of 1850, Stephen Douglas probably deserves more credit than Henry Clay because he actually did a lot of the legwork there. So the Missouri Compromise, basically what happens there is the controversy was over whether Missouri comes in as a slave state or as a free state. Okay, is Missouri going to come in as a slave state or a free state? And at the time, now, of course, a lot of things are changing at this time. Okay, so a lot of things are changing around that time. And what's going on here is that at the time, remember, you've got, we admit a slave state, then a free state, a slave state, and a free state, a slave state, and a free state. And so Missouri was, when you look at a map of the United States and you look at the slave states and the free states as they were, Missouri is just a little bit, a little bit north of, it was the northernmost slave state. When it's about the same as, Maryland, Kentucky, all of that. But it goes a little farther north, and it caused some alarm because, when after the American Revolution, the states north of the Mason-Dixon line started gradually emancipating slaves, and the conventional wisdom was that slavery is eventually going to work its way out. But with Missouri, it was like, well, wait, maybe slavery's actually expanding. And of course, this is the time when the cotton gin is catching on and all of that. And so Henry Clay steps in and says, okay, so the Missouri Compromise, we admit Missouri is a slave state. And then to make sure that there's not a dominance of, because what people were concerned about was that Missouri is going to lead to slave states being in the majority. And that was unacceptable to politicians from the free states at that time. And so he said, look, Massachusetts has this Maine district there, and let's just make that its own state. Makes sense, right? Because they're not even connected. And so Massachusetts then then splits itself in two, which you can, which is possible with the consent of that state. And so Maine is brought in as a free state, and then the Louisiana Purchase is divided at 3630, which south of 3630 is going to be slave territory or groomed for slave states, and then north of 3630 free states. And when you look at north of 3630 versus south, there's a lot more land to the north of 3630. And so that was deemed acceptable. Maine is a free state, Missouri is a slave state, and then the 3630 line. Now, then you had nullification. And of course, nullification was South Carolina's response to the Tariff of 1828. Now, the economy was changing in the North. The Northern economy was starting to focus more on manufacturing. Henry Clay, again, known for his compromises, but also known for the American system, NIP, okay? National Bank, Internal Improvements, Protective Tariff, NIP. And so Henry Clay's American system is basically designed to try to increase internal trade and to promote manufacturing and the development of the West as far as infrastructure. And so the thing is, though, that didn't really help the South, okay, because the South was doing very well at that time, trading back and forth with Europe because they were getting better prices for manufactured goods from Europe than they were getting other places, okay. So as far as that goes, the South really was okay with the status quo and with low tariffs. So when the Tariff of 1828 was passed, which was the highest protective tariff in the history of the United States, Hawley-Smoot tariff during the Depression was second place. But what you have to understand is, first of all, the difference between a revenue and a protective tariff. Okay, a revenue tariff. Revenue means money coming in. So a revenue tariff is a tariff to raise money for the government. The government at that time was primarily funded through tariffs, and so the revenue tariff is to raise money from the government and it's it's typically a low tariff because you're not trying to reduce you're not trying to reduce trade. You're just trying to make a little money for the government. Now, a protective tariff is a tariff that is a tariff that's passed in order to protect domestic industry. Okay, it's there to protect domestic industry, and it's really there kind of to discourage trade. And so as far as that goes, there was a dispute whether protective tariffs are constitutional, whether the federal government can pass a tariff if there's an ulterior motive, if it's not there to pay the debts of the United States, provide for the common defense. Because if you interpret the Constitution very strictly, taxes have to have a justification a justification. So it has to be something that is promoting the general welfare, providing for the common defense, paying the debts of the United States. Well, if the tax is being paid largely by one section of the country, for protecting industry in another section of the country, then that is not paying the debts of the United States. It's not promoting the general overall welfare, and it is not providing for the common defense. And so, Calhoun wrote the South Carolina Exposition, which defended the doctrine of nullification, that basically if the federal government passes a law that violates the Constitution as the people in a state see it, then they can unilaterally nullify that law. Now, what Henry Clay did, Jackson was like, I'm going to go down to South Carolina. I'm going to hang the first nullifier I see. And Henry Clay's like, hold that thought. All right, let me go ahead and see what I can do here. So what Henry Clay did was he engineered the Compromise Tariff of 1833. And this tariff over the next 10 years, it basically tapered down the protective rates. And so South Carolina agreed to rescind its ordinance of nullification, and you avoided what very well could have been a military showdown between the federal government and the state of South Carolina, which was going to refuse to protect tariffs if that nullification ordinance had gone into effect. So you've got the nullification compromise. Then finally, you've got the Compromise of 1850. Now, I've very recently done a video and a rap on YouTube about the Compromise of 1850, or what you're more than welcome to check it out. The Compromise of 1850, of course, the immediate context is the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession. What are we going to do with it? So California petitioned to come into the Union as a free state. All right. And so when California petitioned to come in the Union as a free state, the Southern congressmen are like, whoa, wait a minute here. Aren't we supposed to? I mean, California, that's really big. Okay, maybe that should be divided into two states, the southern part being a slave state and the northern part being a free state. And also, California had never been organized as a territory. And so, there was a procedural issue because these people are asking to come into the Union, but where are they coming from? What gives them the right to do this? Okay, what gives them the right to petition to come into the Union? And so, as far as that is concerned, we're not. They're just like, we don't want to do that. Now, Henry Clay's like, okay, how do we get them into the Union? How do we admit California's a free state, which is something Henry Clay wanted to do? So as far as that goes, then a fugitive slave law, okay? Because one of the biggest complaints of the upper South, especially, was that the northern states were not returning fugitive slaves, even though the Constitution at the time said that in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 but the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 didn't really have a lot of strong mechanisms. It didn't force the states to cooperate, and it didn't give a lot of direct federal support. And so Henry Clay then engineers this kind of compromise, and of course Stephen Douglas as well, that okay, so in order to get some of the Southern congressmen to vote for California to be admitted as a free state, that this stronger fugitive slave law is passed, which obligates states to cooperate with the federal government and puts federal officials in charge of some of these proceedings. And so this, of course, got to be very controversial. You want to know that the Fugitive Slave Act was the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850 because it did not give somebody accused of being a slave, it did not give them jury trials. And there were actually some northern states who passed personal liberty laws saying that anybody that is accused of being a slave in this state will get a jury trial as is their right by the Constitution. So what we have there is what they would call de facto nullification. They didn't nullify the Fugitive Slave Act, but they passed state laws which would make it more difficult for federal officials to enforce that law. So so you've got that. Admit California is a free state, a stronger fugitive slave law. Then the next two of the five parts are about the Mexican Cession. Okay, so what they decide to do is in order to not have a controversy or debate over slavery in the Mexican Cession, you had Lewis Cass and Stephen Douglas. They had the doctrine of popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty to let the settlers decide the status of slavery in the territories. So that is agreed on. That way, Congress doesn't have to make a decision. And then the fourth part is that Texas still claimed land that was in the Mexican cession. Okay, so around Santa Fe, New Mexico, what is today Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the federal government gave Texas $10 million. They assumed Texas war debt of $10 million, and Texas gave up the claims in the Mexican cession. So that's done. 2 and 2. Okay, divide this into parts. And then finally, the fifth part was that the slave trade, not slavery itself, but the slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. Okay, so that's the other part of this. All right, and remember, those of you watching on YouTube, there is a link to learn more about Fiveable and its products, and also, or its membership. And also, I want to let's see. So you can use the code Tom Ritchie before midnight if you want to get a Fiveable membership. I'll go ahead and put that here in the comments. And also, there is going to be a Kahoot game that is going to be open to everyone. Okay, so make sure if you want to, the Kahoot game is limited in the number of people that can participate. So if you want to go ahead and get yourself on the list for the Kahoot game, I've gone ahead and put that into the description. If you go to fiveable.me/Kahoot, okay, so if you want to register for the Kahoot game, I'm going to put this in the YouTube chat. Okay, make sure that y'all register for that. And of course, if you want to get information about a Fiveable membership, that is fiveable.me/sign up. Yeah, AP Euro, I'm going to actually be broadcasting again at 9. Okay, I will be broadcasting again at 9 for AP Euro. So we're going to be doing, right now I'm focused on AP US, but I'm going to be focusing on AP Euro next time. Okay. All right, so then we go into, okay, so we've got still a few more questions from Fiveable members here. Can I go into the important court cases associated with Chief Justice John Marshall? Now, first of all, there is Marbury versus Madison, okay, and that is the case where the Supreme Court asserted the power of judicial review. That remember, in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Jefferson and Madison wrote that it was basically the job of the states to interpret the Constitution. And so then John Marshall's like, it's the job of the Supreme Court. And so that was the first case where the Supreme Court actively asserted its prerogative to decide whether or not a law is compatible with the Constitution and throw it out if it's not. Then you've got McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland. The state of Maryland tried to tax a branch of the Second Bank of the United States. This is a supremacy clause case. Okay, if you take AP Government next year, remember this. This is a supremacy clause case. And so as far as that, the supremacy clause, essentially, if the federal government passes a law that is consistent with the Constitution, then that law supersedes state law and states cannot interfere with it. Now, if it is not according to the Constitution, then the state can interfere with it and that sort of thing. But in McCulloch versus Maryland, Maryland was trying to tax the bank. Now, you know that John Marshall, and this is the key, John Marshall was a Federalist and also acting as more of a Hamiltonian loose constructionist. So, of course, John Marshall believed that the bank was an actual valid constitutional responsibility of the federal government. And so given that the bank was judged by the Marshall Court to be a legitimate constitutional responsibility, then the Supremacy Clause stops the state of Maryland from being able to tax the bank. But remember, on one side, you've got the bank. On the other side, you've got a state. Which one is John Marshall going to go with? There you go. And then you've got Gibbons versus Ogden, which was a Commerce Clause case. Now, this goes on with when you're thinking about the rise of the market economy. during the Jacksonian period, where you see that like steamboats and that sort of thing. Well, New York, the state of New York, gave a steamship company a monopoly. And so then Cornelius Vanderbilt and his bunch, they start running a steamship line between New York and New Jersey. And the state of New York tried to say, you can't come in here and do this because you don't have a license in the state of New York. You don't have monopoly. And so in Gibbons versus Ogden, the Marshall Court ruled that, well, no, that is interstate commerce because they're going between states. So one state cannot stop commerce from coming into the state by granting a monopoly. And so what impact did the Transcontinental Railroad have on Native Americans? The Transcontinental Railroad was pretty much the nail in the coffin there, because you can't have transcontinental railroads and have large herds of buffalo. And so that's where you're running into, essentially, the buffalo were being killed off, which made the Plains Indians' lifestyle untenable, because if there aren't enough buffalo to hunt, then that was their food supply, basically, that they ate bison and followed the bison herds around. So yeah, the Transcontinental Railroad, pretty much the nail in the coffin for the Western Native Americans. What would I consider the most important acts and taxes that preceded? Okay, now, Elliot, the Stamp Act would be the most important. Okay, now it really depends on you. You're trying to make a 3, you're trying to make a 5. Now, if you're trying to make a 5, you want to know that there are 3 taxes passed during the 1760s: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Now, I have got a video on my YouTube channel, Parliament Taxes the Colonies, where I go into that. I would recommend possibly taking a look at that video because I go into a lot more depth. But the Stamp Act was the most offensive of these taxes because it was an internal tax. And although the Sugar Act and the Townshend Acts were unpopular, nobody disputed Parliament's authority to tax imports. It's kind of like if your parents take your phone. You don't like it, but you don't dispute your parents' ability to take your phone. So that's something that, it's like, okay, you don't like it, but they can do it. But then the Stamp Act, since it was an internal tax and hadn't been approved by the colonial legislatures, they weren't too crazy about that. All right, so as far as that goes, then what were some of the, okay, so as far as that stuff, Alberto, women's rights, you want to know the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which produced the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, which said that all men and women are created equal, and it demanded the right to vote for women, which of course was not recognized. Stay hydrated, kids. Was not added to the Constitution until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So that, and also you'd want to know Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, possibly Lucretia Mott would be another person to associate with the women's rights movement during the antebellum period. Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a Fiveable sponsored broadcast. Of course, it is being broadcast on my channel, and I hope those of you on YouTube enjoyed it. I will be doing a YouTube broadcast very soon, so keep your eyes open for that. Make sure you've got me on notifications so you know when I'm going live and that sort of thing. All right, so as far as that goes, remember, for more information about a Fiveable membership, go to fiveable.me/sign up. You can use the code Tom Ritchie for 30% off, and that gets you access to weekly reviews from here on out and a lot of good stuff there. Now, the Kahoot games, which are not members only, they're available to everyone, okay? They're available to everyone. So with that, go ahead and, take a look at that. Sign up for the Kahoot. You can go ahead and put an email in and reserve your spot. So make sure that y'all do that. And I'm going to be coming back at 9 to do AP Euro. Okay, so make sure as far as that goes that you're in line with that. But thank y'all so much tonight, and I'm looking forward to broadcasting for Euro in about another hour. It is always a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.